eating with tax collectors and sinners. Picture the scene: a respected rabbi sitting at a dinner table, not in a synagogue, not with other religious leaders, but in the home of a tax collector, surrounded by the kind of people good Jews wouldn't even make eye contact with on the street. The Pharisees stood outside watching through the windows, their disgust barely contained. They couldn't understand it. This man claimed to speak for God, yet he was breaking bread with traitors and prostitutes. Tax collectors weren't just unpopular in first-century Palestine. They were considered collaborators with Rome, extortionists who grew rich off their own people's suffering. They were ceremonially unclean, spiritually contaminated. And the sinners Jesus ate with, they were the outcasts, the morally compromised, the religiously hopeless. No self-respecting rabbi would risk his reputation by associating with them. But Jesus didn't just associate. He reclined at their tables. He shared their food. He treated them like friends. When the Pharisees questioned his disciples about this scandalous behavior, Jesus gave them an answer that shattered every religious assumption they held. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. In one sentence, he redefined the entire mission of God. The religious establishment had turned faith into a gatekeeping operation, a system where you had to clean yourself up before you could approach God. Jesus flipped that completely. He went to the mess first. This wasn't just about being nice to outcasts. This was a theological earthquake. The Pharisees believed that holiness meant separation from sin and sinners. Purity required distance, but Jesus demonstrated that true holiness isn't something that can be contaminated. It's something that transforms. His presence didn't make him unclean, it made others whole. The religious leaders missed this entirely. They were so focused on protecting their righteousness that they forgot righteousness was meant to reach people, not repel them. Now hold that mirror up to today's churches. How many congregations have become comfortable clubs for the already convinced? How many Christians cross the street to avoid the homeless, stay silent around co-workers who curse, or create entire subcultures so insulated from the world that sinners would never feel welcome inside? We've built pristine sanctuaries and polished programs, but Jesus built his ministry in the margins. He didn't wait for people to get their lives together before he loved them. He loved them into transformation. The uncomfortable question we have to ask is this: if Jesus showed up in our churches today, would he feel more at home in the fellowship hall or at the local bar? Would he be having coffee with the deacons or lunch with the people our members gossip about? We say we follow Jesus, but we've sanitized his mission. We've made the gospel respectable, safe, and in doing so, we've made it something Jesus wouldn't recognize. Because the real Jesus didn't come to comfort the comfortable. He came to disrupt, to challenge, to eat with the wrong people and make the religious crowd squirm. The tax collectors and sinners knew they were broken. They didn't pretend to have it all together. And that's exactly why Jesus chose them. Not because their sin didn't matter, but because their honesty did. The Pharisees were just as broken. They just hid it behind religious performance. Jesus came for people who knew they needed saving, not people who thought they'd already saved themselves. That truth still stands, and it still makes religious people uncomfortable. Healing on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was sacred. God himself had commanded it, a day of rest woven into the fabric of creation. But by the time Jesus walked the earth, the religious leaders had turned it into something else entirely. They'd built a fence around the law, then a fence around that fence, until rest became a burden and mercy became a violation. Healing on the Sabbath wasn't just controversial, it was considered a direct assault on God's holiness. Jesus healed a man with a withered hand right there in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The Pharisees were watching, waiting. They didn't care about the man's suffering. They cared about catching Jesus in a technical violation. And Jesus knew it. He could have waited one more day. He could have healed the man in private. But instead, he made it a public confrontation. He asked them a question that cut to the heart of their twisted theology. Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? They had no answer because their system had no room for compassion that didn't follow the rules. On another occasion, Jesus healed a woman who had been crippled for 18 years. 18 years of pain. 18 years of being unable to stand up straight. And the synagogue leader's response? Outrage, not at her suffering, but at the timing of her healing. There are 6 days for work, he said, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. The cruelty of that statement is staggering. He valued his interpretation of the law more than a woman's freedom from bondage. Jesus called him a hypocrite because these same leaders would untie their ox or donkey on the Sabbath to give it water, but a daughter of Abraham had to wait. The religious establishment had completely missed the point of the Sabbath. It was never meant to be a legalistic obstacle course. It was a gift, a day to remember that God cares more about relationship than performance. But they'd turned it into a test, a way to measure who was righteous and who wasn't. And in doing so, they made the Sabbath itself a form of cruelty. Jesus came to restore its original intent. He declared that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He was the Lord of the Sabbath, and if doing good violated their rules, then their rules had become evil. Fast forward to modern Christianity. How many churches have created their own versions of Sabbath legalism? Maybe it's not about healing on a specific day, but it's about 1,000 other rules that measure spirituality by external compliance. Don't drink, don't dance, don't listen to that music, don't watch that movie, don't ask those questions. We've created our own fences around faith, and then we've judged people for not staying inside them. We've made Christianity about what you avoid instead of who you love. Jesus didn't come to make religion harder. He came to expose how religion had already become a weapon against the very people God loved. And if we're honest, we're still doing it. We're still more concerned with appearances than with mercy. We're still more comfortable with rules than with grace. We're still letting people suffer in silence because helping them might make us look too liberal, too loose, too much like Jesus. The Pharisees wanted a God they could control, a faith they could measure. Jesus gave them neither, and that's still the scandal today. Touching lepers and the unclean. Leprosy wasn't just a disease, it was a death sentence, not just physically but socially and spiritually. Lepers were required by law to live outside the community, to shout, "Unclean, unclean," whenever anyone came near. They couldn't worship in the temple, couldn't embrace their children, couldn't touch another human being. The religious system said they were cursed, abandoned by God, their suffering a visible sign of divine judgment, and no one's allowed to touch them. Then Jesus reached out his hand and touched a leper, not after healing him, before. The text is clear. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. In that moment, Jesus violated every purity law in the Jewish code. He became ceremonially unclean. He risked contamination. He broke the rules that kept society safe from disease and disorder. But he didn't just break the rules. He shattered the theology behind them. Because his touch didn't make him unclean. His touch made the leper clean. This wasn't an isolated incident. Jesus touched bleeding women who were considered unclean. He touched the dead, who made anyone who contacted them ceremonially impure for days. He didn't just heal from a distance. though he could have. He didn't just speak words of restoration, though his words alone were powerful enough. He touched, because touch communicates something words cannot. It says, "You are not disgusting. You are not untouchable. You are not beyond the reach of love." And for people who had been exiled by religion, that touch was the gospel. The religious leaders built their entire system on separation, clean from unclean, holy from unholy, righteous from sinful. They believed that holiness was something fragile, something that could be contaminated if you got too close to the wrong people. But Jesus demonstrated a different kind of holiness, one that wasn't afraid of contact, one that didn't shrink back from suffering or shame, one that didn't protect itself at the expense of the broken. His holiness was contagious in the opposite direction. It spread healing instead of contamination. Where do we see this today? In churches that won't let divorced people serve in leadership, in congregations that whisper about mental illness like it's a moral failure, in communities that exile the addicted, the abused, the sexually broken, anyone whose mess is too visible to ignore. We've created a Christianity where people have to hide their wounds to be accepted, where you can't ask for help without being disqualified from service, where grace is preached from the pulpit but withheld in the pews. Jesus didn't minister from a safe distance. He got close. He touched the untouchable. He ate with the excluded. He embraced the contaminated. And the religious people of his day hated him for it. They called him a friend of sinners like it was an insult, not realizing it was the most accurate description of his entire ministry. If we claim to follow Jesus, but we won't get our hands dirty with real human brokenness, then we're following someone else. Because the real Jesus didn't just preach about love. He touched lepers. Overturning tables in the temple. The temple was the heart of Jewish worship, the dwelling place of God's presence, the one place on earth where heaven and earth met. And by the time Jesus arrived, it had become a marketplace, the court of the Gentiles. The only place where non-Jews could come to pray and seek God had been turned into a commercial operation. Money changers set up tables. Merchants sold sacrificial animals at inflated prices. The priests took their cut. It was efficient, organized, profitable. And it made Jesus furious. He didn't write a letter of complaint. He didn't schedule a meeting with the religious authorities to discuss reform. He made a whip out of cords, and he drove them all out. He overturned the tables. He scattered the coins. He released the animals. And he declared, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." This wasn't a loss of control. This was righteous rage, carefully directed at a system that had turned worship into profit and blocked the very people who most needed access to God. The religious establishment had rationalized it all. People needed animals for sacrifice, so why not sell them at the temple? People needed the right currency to pay the temple tax, so why not offer exchange services? It was convenient, practical, but it had a cost. The noise, the commerce, the exploitation. It created a barrier between seekers and God. And worse, it communicated that access to God was a transaction, something you purchased, something the powerful controlled. Jesus rejected that entirely. What enraged him most was the location, the court of the Gentiles, the one space where outsiders, pagans, seekers from the nations, could come and encounter the God of Israel. And the religious leaders had filled it with chaos and commerce. They didn't care about the Gentiles. They saw them as second class, less important. Their money was welcome, but their prayers were an afterthought. Jesus came to tear down every wall that separated people from God, and the religious system had built those walls higher in the name of efficiency and order. Now look at the modern church. How many ministries have become businesses first and mission second? How much of Christianity has been packaged, branded, and sold? We build massive buildings and call them houses of God, then fill them with bookstores and coffee shops. We measure success by attendance numbers and budget size. We create membership tiers and VIP access. We've turned worship into a production and the gospel into a product. And somewhere in all of it, the seekers get lost. Jesus didn't oppose organization. He opposed exploitation. He didn't reject structure. He rejected systems that value profit over people. And he didn't condemn commerce in general. He condemned it when it blocked access to God. The question we have to ask is, what are we blocking? Who have we made it harder to reach God? Who can't get through the noise and the gatekeeping and the religious machinery? If Jesus walked into our churches today with a whip, what tables would he overturn? What systems would he dismantle? What barriers would he tear down? Because the Jesus who cleared the temple hasn't changed. Only our ability to ignore him has. What do you think? Put it in the comments below. Speaking with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jews didn't speak to Samaritans. It wasn't just cultural preference. It was deep-seated hatred. Centuries of religious division and ethnic hostility. The Jews saw Samaritans as half-breeds, theological heretics who'd corrupted true worship. The Samaritans returned the contempt. So when a Jewish man traveling through Samaria stopped at a well at noon, and a Samaritan woman came to draw water, the expectation was clear. Ignore her. Don't make eye contact. Certainly don't engage in conversation. Jesus did the opposite. He asked her for a drink. That simple request shattered multiple barriers at once: gender, ethnicity, religion, social status. Jewish rabbis didn't speak to women in public, not even their own wives. They especially didn't speak to foreign women, and they absolutely didn't speak to women with questionable moral histories. But Jesus didn't just speak to her, he initiated the conversation. He made himself vulnerable by asking for help. He treated her like someone worth talking to, worth listening to, worth saving, and his disciples were shocked when they returned and found him doing exactly that. The conversation went deeper than anyone expected. Jesus didn't just engage in small talk. He offered her living water, eternal life, spiritual truth that most rabbis would never waste on a Samaritan. When she tried to deflect by bringing up old religious debates about where to worship, Jesus gave her theology that would reshape everything. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. He was telling her that all the old divisions, all the arguments about mountains and temples, were about to become irrelevant. What mattered was the heart. Then he did something even more radical. When she mentioned the Messiah, Jesus revealed his identity to her. I, the one speaking to you, I am he. Think about that. The first person Jesus explicitly told he was the Messiah wasn't a priest, wasn't a scholar, wasn't even a man. It was a Samaritan woman with 5 failed marriages and a current relationship that didn't qualify as marriage at all. The religious establishment would have considered her the least qualified person on earth to receive divine revelation. Jesus made her the first evangelist to her entire town. How does the modern church handle the outsiders? The people who don't fit our demographic? The ones with complicated pasts and messy presents? Do we cross the street to avoid them? Or do we stop and ask them for water? Do we treat them like projects to fix? Or people to know? Jesus didn't go to the well to condemn her. He went to offer her what religion never could: acceptance without performance, truth without judgment, life without pretense. Today's church has its own Samaritans: the divorced, the addicted, the gay, the tattooed, the doubters, the ones who ask too many questions or come from the wrong background or vote for the wrong party. We found new ways to divide, new reasons to exclude, new categories of people we're uncomfortable sitting next to. We say they're welcome, but only if they change first. Jesus said they're welcome, and he'll change them himself. That's the difference between religion and gospel. Religion builds walls. Jesus tears them down. Defending the woman caught in adultery, they dragged her into the temple courts in front of everyone. A woman caught in adultery, caught in the act, they threw her at Jesus' feet like evidence in a trial. The scribes and Pharisees stood around her, stones already in hand, quoting Moses. The law says she should be stoned. What do you say? They didn't care about justice. They didn't care about her. They didn't even care about the man she was with, who by law should have been dragged there too. This was a trap, a test, and she was just the bait. Jesus bent down and started writing in the dirt. The text doesn't tell us what he wrote. Maybe the sins of her accusers, maybe the names of their own secret failures, maybe nothing at all, just a pause to let their self-righteousness hang in the air. They kept pressing him, demanding an answer, so he stood up and gave them one they didn't expect. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he bent down and wrote in the dirt again. The silence must have been deafening. One by one, starting with the oldest of. They dropped their stones and walked away. The elders first, because they'd lived long enough to know their own guilt. The younger ones followed, until it was just Jesus and the woman. The only person in that crowd who actually had the right to condemn her chose not to. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She looked around. "No one, sir." And Jesus said the words that would echo through history. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Notice what Jesus didn't do. He didn't excuse her sin. He didn't say adultery was fine. He didn't pretend she hadn't done anything wrong, but he also didn't condemn her. He didn't shame her. He didn't let the religious mob use her sin as entertainment. He gave her dignity. He gave her truth. And he gave her a future. Go and leave your life of sin isn't a threat. It's an invitation. It's grace with direction, love with truth. And it stands in stark contrast to what the religious leaders offered, which was death. The Pharisees wanted to use her sin to trap Jesus, but Jesus used their hypocrisy to free her. They wanted to prove they were righteous by executing her. Jesus proved he was righteous by saving her. They saw a woman defined entirely by her worst moment. Jesus saw a woman who could walk away and start over. That's the scandal of grace. It doesn't minimize sin, but it doesn't maximize shame either. It offers something a religion never can, a way out. Where is this tension in today's church? We claim to be people of grace, but we often act like the Pharisees with stones in hand. We publicly shame people for moral failures. We destroy reputations over sin we'd want hidden in our own lives. We use people's worst moments as ammunition for our own sense of superiority. And we do it all in the name of protecting holiness. But Jesus showed us something different. Holiness doesn't need to destroy sinners to prove itself. Holiness redeems. And if we're busy picking up stones instead of offering grace, we're not following Jesus. We're following the Pharisees, and they walked away in silence because even they knew they were wrong. Publicly criticizing Pharisees and religious leaders. Jesus reserved his harshest words for religious leaders, not prostitutes, not tax collectors, not pagans or drunkards or thieves. The people who made him angriest were the ones who claimed to speak for God, but used that authority to burden and control others. In Matthew 23, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites!" 7 times he said it. 7 public denunciations of the religious elite. He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, full of dead bones on the inside. He said they traveled land and sea to make a single convert, only to make that person twice as much a child of hell as they were. He accused them of straining out gnats while swallowing camels, obsessing over minor rules while ignoring justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He said they shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, refusing to enter themselves and blocking everyone else from going in. This wasn't gentle correction. This was prophetic rage. The religious leaders had turned faith into performance. They made long prayers in public to be seen by others. They wore their phylacteries wide and their tassels long to signal their devotion. They loved places of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They demanded respect, but gave none to the people they were supposed to serve. Jesus called it what it was: spiritual abuse. They'd taken the law of God, which was meant to lead people to life, and weaponized it into a system of control and exclusion. But the worst part wasn't their hypocrisy. It was the damage they caused. Jesus said they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. They created impossible standards, then condemned people for failing to meet them. They taught for doctrines the commandments of men, adding human tradition on top of divine law until the burden was unbearable. And when people broke under the weight, the Pharisees blamed them for being weak instead of questioning whether the load was ever meant to be carried. Jesus didn't oppose religious leadership. He opposed corrupt religious leadership. He didn't reject authority. He rejected authority that used God's name to serve its own ego. And he didn't criticize people for being imperfect. He criticized them for pretending to be perfect while destroying everyone else. The tragedy is that the Pharisees thought they were serving God. They believed their strictness proved their devotion. But they'd become obstacles to the very kingdom they claimed to represent. Now look at modern church leadership. How many pastors and elders have become more concerned with control than discipleship? How many denominations have added layers of man-made rules and called it holiness? How many congregations are run like corporations, where the leaders are untouchable and the members are expected to serve without question? Jesus would have the same words for us: whitewashed tombs, hypocrites, blind guides. We've created Christian celebrity culture, pastoral empires, theological gatekeeping, and we've done it all while claiming to represent the humble carpenter from Nazareth. If Jesus walked into many of our churches today, he wouldn't be invited to preach. He'd be escorted out. Because the real Jesus disrupts power. And religious leaders hate that. Allowing women to be his disciples and followers. In first-century Jewish culture, women weren't taught Torah. They weren't counted in the synagogue. They weren't called as disciples. Rabbis had a saying, "Rather should the words of the Torah be burned than entrusted to a woman." Women could listen from a distance. They could serve and support, but they couldn't learn as equals. They couldn't sit at the rabbi's feet and be trained like men. The religious system had made this clear. Women were second class in the kingdom of God. Jesus rejected that entirely. Mary of Bethany sat at Jesus' feet, listening to his teaching. Her sister Martha was busy serving, doing what women were expected to do. When Martha complained that Mary wasn't helping, expecting Jesus to send her back to the kitchen, he did the opposite. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. In that moment, Jesus affirmed a woman's right to be a disciple, to learn, to sit at the feet of a rabbi and absorb his teaching like any male student would. It was revolutionary, but it went further than that. Jesus didn't just allow women to listen. He included them in his traveling ministry. Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many others traveled with Jesus and the 12, supporting them out of their own means. They heard the private teachings. They witnessed the miracles. They were present for the most important moments of his ministry. And when Jesus was crucified, while most of the male disciples fled in fear, the women stayed. They watched him die. They prepared his body. They were the first ones at the tomb. That's why it matters that Jesus appeared first to women after his resurrection. In a culture where women's testimony wasn't even valid in court, Jesus made them the first witnesses of the most important event in human history. He could have appeared to Peter, to John, or to the religious leaders who needed proof. But he appeared to Mary Magdalene, and he told her, "Go and tell my brothers." He made a woman the first preacher of the resurrection, the first evangelist of the gospel, the apostle to the apostles. The early church struggled with this. Paul's letters show the tension. Some passages affirm women in leadership: Phoebe the deacon, Priscilla the teacher, Junia the apostle. Other passages seem to restrict them. Scholars debate the context and meaning, but what's undeniable is that Jesus himself had no problem elevating women, teaching women, empowering women to speak and serve and lead. He treated them as image bearers, co-heirs, partners in the mission of the kingdom. Fast forward to today, how many churches still silence women? How many denominations refuse to let women preach, teach, or hold authority over men? How many congregations claim to follow Jesus while ignoring his example of inclusion and empowerment? We quote Paul's letters, but we ignore Jesus' actions. We build theological systems to justify exclusion, while Jesus built a movement that shattered every gender barrier of his day. The question isn't whether women can lead. Jesus already answered that. The question is whether we'll follow his lead or cling to the religious traditions he came to dismantle. The religious leaders of Jesus' day thought they were protecting truth, guarding holiness, maintaining order. They believed their rules made them righteous, and their traditions kept them pure. But Jesus showed them something they couldn't accept. Their religion had become a wall between people and God. Every expectation he broke, every rule he violated, every barrier he crossed, it all pointed to the same truth. God isn't looking for perfect religious performance. He's looking for hearts that are willing to be changed. And the people who thought they had it all figured out, the ones who measured their righteousness by how many rules they followed, they were the ones who missed him completely. The uncomfortable reality is that it's still happening. We've built our own systems, created our own standards, decided who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's not, who deserves grace and who deserves judgment. And somewhere in all of it, we've turned Jesus into a mascot for our religious preferences instead of the radical disruptor he actually was. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if there are topics that didn't make the list or topics you want us to feature, please leave them in the comments.